The first-class cabin fell into an almost suffocating stillness as the young flight attendant's voice cut through the hum of the air conditioning. "Excuse me, Mom, you need to move," she said, her words tight, deliberate, like steel snapping. Every passenger in the front rows froze mid-sip of champagne. The woman in seat 1A looked up slowly, dark eyes steady beneath the rim of her oversized sunglasses. She adjusted the strap of her leather bag, and for a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to contract around her. "Move?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp, carrying the weight of someone who had been underestimated too many times. Behind the curtain that separated the VIP lounge of the cabin from the rest of the aircraft, Captain Thomas Hargrove's footsteps echoed, heavy and measured. 50 passengers turned their heads as he approached, silver hair glinting under the cabin lights. His jaw was set, a practiced expression of authority, the kind that could silence a room without a word. Yet something about this woman, her posture, the quiet strength in her shoulders, made him pause. Not for long. He was the captain. His word was law, or so he believed. The woman in 1A reached into her jacket and pulled out a simple leather wallet, her fingers lingering on its edge. She didn't speak, only observed. The flight attendant, Emily Lawson, shifted nervously, gripping the strap of the tablet she held. "This seat is reserved for our VIP, ma'am. You don't belong here," Emily said, the words spilling out faster than she intended. The man who had just stepped into 1B, a silver-haired hedge fund manager, leaned back in his seat, raising an eyebrow at the interaction, not yet understanding the storm that was about to break. The woman adjusted her hoodie, letting the hood fall back slightly, revealing a face that had the weight of countless boardroom battles etched into its lines. Her lips pressed together, controlled, deliberate. "I have a first-class ticket," she said softly, almost to herself. The cabin seemed to inhale, as if waiting for her next move. Hargrove leaned over, eyes narrowing. "Your ticket doesn't say that. The manifest indicates priority seating, not..." He trailed off, caught mid-thought by an instinctive caution he hadn't felt in decades. Emily fumbled with her tablet, double-checking the manifest, the cabin tense with the unspoken knowledge that something was off. "Priority status," Emily whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "That can't be right." The flight attendant's hands shook slightly, the authority she tried to project cracking under the weight of uncertainty. The woman in 1A exhaled slowly. She could have unleashed everything she knew in that instant, called the airline's legal team, the board, anyone with power. She could have ended Hargrove's career with a single phone call. But she waited. She observed. She let the first wave of judgment crash against her, like wind against glass. The passengers, 50 in total, watched in varying states of disbelief. Some with pity, some with silent approval, many unsure what to think. "Captain," Emily said quietly, voice tight with nerves. "She insists the ticket is correct. It's in the system." Hargrove's eyes flicked from Emily to the woman, the tension in his shoulders coiling tighter. His authority, which had felt absolute moments ago, now encountered something it had never faced. A silent, unshakable defiance, rooted not in arrogance, but in a lifetime of power tempered with discipline. The woman shifted in her seat, crossing one leg over the other, the movement measured. She pulled out her phone, fingers tapping swiftly, eyes scanning the cabin as though she could read the energy of each passenger. The young flight attendant, barely 25, noticed the calm precision, the awareness, and felt a pang of fear. This wasn't just a passenger. This was someone who understood leverage, who understood observation. Hargrove straightened, stepping closer. "You will move to the back row, man, now, or I will have you escorted off this plane." His voice was low, resonant, meant to carry authority, meant to intimidate. The passengers glanced at one another. Whispers rose like the faint hiss of a storm gathering on the horizon. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't flinch, She could feel the energy of the cabin, the fear, the expectation. She looked at Hargrove, long and direct, and said, "I will take the seat assigned to me." Her words were soft, deliberate, but in them was a weight that pressed down on the chest of every witness. Hargrove's fingers tightened around the edge of the armrest of the aisle seat next to her. He was used to compliance. He was not used to being questioned, to being measured against someone he did not yet understand. Emily glanced nervously toward the cockpit. Hargrove was silent for a long moment, the cabin quiet, but for the subtle creak of the leather seats and the distant hum of the engines. The woman's breathing was even, controlled, but her eyes scanned the space as though calculating every outcome, every probability. She could have revealed her identity at any moment, the full power she wielded as the owner of this aircraft, the CEO of the company that literally fueled this plane. She chose patience. "Do you know who I am?" Hargrove asked finally, his tone rising, a mixture of exasperation and incredulity. The woman tilted her head slightly, eyes meeting his without fear. "I'm someone you should have respected the moment I stepped on this plane," she said. The cabin shifted. The silver-haired hedge fund manager in 1B stiffened, sensing a tension that had nothing to do with seat assignments. Hargrove's hand gestured toward the rear. "You will comply," he said, authority fraying, "or I will involve airport security." The woman's fingers tapped lightly against the leather wallet she had left on the tray. She could have called in reinforcements. She could have escalated to legal or federal authorities. She did nothing. She let Hargrove overextend himself. The passengers watched the dance of authority and defiance. Each breath waited. A woman in the third row shifted, whispering to her husband, "Do you see what she's doing?" The husband's hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white. The tension was cinematic, visible in every glance, every movement. Hargrove's eyes narrowed, calculating, but the woman's calm, controlled presence rendered every calculation moot. Then, finally, the reveal came. She pulled a small, matte black ID from her wallet, flipped it open with deliberate slowness. Hargrove's eyes flicked down, caught on the embossed gold letters and the holographic strip. For a heartbeat, the cabin went still. The world seemed to pause. She wasn't just any passenger. She was the owner of the airline, the CEO who had spent decades building her empire from nothing. Hargrove froze. The authority he wielded so confidently moments ago, now evaporating into shock. The woman, Naomi Brooks, let the ID hang between them. "I own this plane," she said, voice quiet but carrying through the cabin. Every passenger, every flight attendant, every member of the crew felt the shift. The tension became electricity. The captain, the man who had been ready to eject her, now stood in silent disbelief. She could have smiled, she could have gloatingly celebrated, but she didn't. She held the room in suspended judgment. And in that suspended moment, the first-class cabin understood something essential. Power is not in uniforms. Power is not in authority granted by tenure or ego. Power is in knowledge, in timing, in restraint, in understanding when to act and when to wait. Naomi Brooks had every reason to act. She chose observation, control, and precision. The climax had arrived, and the first plot twist, the complete reversal of authority, had been revealed. The cabin held its collective breath, waiting for the next move. Security could not be called. The captain could not move her. The VIP she had been asked to yield to hadn't even boarded yet. Every element of control in the cabin had shifted. Naomi's fingers rested lightly on her wallet, her eyes sharp, unyielding. Every passenger understood, in that cinematic instant, that nothing on this plane was as it seemed. She was underestimated. They had misjudged her. And in moments, the narrative of authority, power, and judgment would unravel completely. but she had yet to act beyond the reveal. The cabin was still, but the air felt heavier now, charged with a tension that prickled at every nerve. Naomi Brooks sat straight, shoulders back, her calm a sharp contrast to the flurry of whispers spreading through the rows. Captain Thomas Hargrove's jaw was tight, his hands flexing at his sides as he tried to regain composure. Every second he hesitated, the passenger's eyes darted from him to Naomi, silently judging, silently wondering what had just unfolded. Emily Lawson, the flight attendant who had first confronted Naomi, glanced toward the rear, then back at the woman in 1A. Her fingers trembled slightly on the tablet. She had been certain she was enforcing policy, upholding order, yet now it felt absurd. Her authority had evaporated in the face of truth. She tried to meet Naomi's eyes, but quickly looked away, swallowed by guilt and fear. Hargrove cleared his throat, voice tight. "Ma'am, I need to understand. This is—" He faltered, realizing words failed him. Naomi's gaze swept the cabin, catching every glance, every subtle shift in posture. "Captain," she said slowly, deliberately, "you have been given authority over this plane, yes. But authority is not ownership. Compliance is not respect." Her words hit the room with the force of a gavel. From the aisle, Julian Thompson, the VIP who had been scheduled to board later, appeared. He was mid-20s, polished but intoxicated, and had already begun boasting about connections and family influence. He froze as Naomi's presence filled the space. For the first time in his life, someone had stopped him without a word, without physical force, and yet with complete authority. He hesitated, unsure whether to step forward or retreat, caught between expectation and reality. Naomi's fingers tapped lightly on the edge of her wallet. "Mr. Thompson," she said, voice calm but steel-lined, "I suggest you remain seated until proper boarding is complete. Any further disruption will be noted and addressed according to company policy and federal law." The cabin collectively exhaled, sensing the finality of her tone. Even the flight attendants stiffened, realizing the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. Passengers who had earlier murmured, some recording discreetly on their phones, now straightened, uncertain how to behave. The young man in seat 2B, previously laughing at the unfolding scene, lowered his camera and leaned back, eyes wide. Naomi had flipped the script without a single overtly aggressive act. She had reshaped the cabin's hierarchy with observation, timing, and absolute authority. Emily approached cautiously, voice low. "Ma'am, I wasn't aware—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the contradiction between her instructions and the reality before her. Naomi's eyes met hers, sharp but measured. "I understand your role, Emily, but authority exercised without understanding is a risk, not a safeguard. The moment you assume judgment without knowledge, you place everyone at risk." Hargrove exhaled slowly, tension radiating from him. For decades he had maintained order through the projection of confidence, the intimidation of crew and passengers alike. Now, his own methods had been rendered hollow. He realized that every decision, every prior assertion of power, was contingent on assumptions that no longer held. Naomi Brooks had dismantled them in minutes. The hum of the engines seemed muted in the silence that followed. Every passenger felt it. The shift in control. The awareness that appearances could deceive. That status and perceived authority were fragile constructs. Naomi leaned slightly forward, resting her elbows on the armrests, eyes scanning the cabin once more. She measured the space, the people, the power dynamics. Her patience had created anticipation, and anticipation had created respect. Julian shifted uneasily, muttering to himself. He realized that the entitlement he carried like armor was meaningless here. Naomi's calm, precise control rendered it irrelevant. He slumped back into his seat, the first real lesson in humility of his young life. Naomi's phone buzzed briefly. A single message from her legal team, confirming that all internal systems had been notified of her position and of potential boarding irregularities. She ignored it for now. There was no need to act immediately. The psychological advantage had been won. The captain, the attendants, the VIP, and the passengers were all aware, yet powerless, to reverse what had just occurred. Emily exhaled shakily, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I understand," she whispered, more to herself than to Naomi. The weight of the lesson settled over her. Authority exercised incorrectly had consequences, and respect was not conferred by uniform or rank alone. Naomi straightened, the air around her seeming to expand with her presence. "We will proceed," she said softly, but the gravity in her tone resonated throughout the cabin. Every person on board felt it. This was not a confrontation. This was a recalibration. Order had been restored, but not through fear, not through threat, not through force. It had been restored through presence, intelligence, and an unwavering sense of rightful authority. Captain Hargrove took a step back, his eyes locked on Naomi. For the first time, he understood that his position as captain did not equate to ultimate control. Decisions could be questioned, assumptions overturned, and power redefined. He nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, conceding the silent truth. Naomi leaned back in her seat, adjusting the strap of her bag. Her calm was magnetic, chilling. She had transformed a simple boarding dispute into a lesson on judgment, respect, and power dynamics that would echo long after the flight landed. The passengers, once observers, now participants in a tableau of authority, sat in quiet realization. Every whispered speculation, every recording, every glance carried the weight of what had just been revealed. The hum of the engines grew louder as the plane taxied, a soundtrack to the tension that had unfolded. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself a moment of composure. She had been underestimated, judged by appearances, dismissed by those who thought they held power. Yet she had claimed authority in a way that was total, precise, and irrevocable. As the cabin settled, Naomi Brooks, billionaire airline owner in disguise, remained seated, quiet, unassuming to the casual observer, but every element of the flight now bent subtly under her presence. The stage was set. The twist had occurred. Authority had been questioned, and the lesson was clear. Power was never given. It was recognized, seized, and commanded with intelligence, timing, and self-possession. The engines roared as the plane lifted from the runway, the city of New York shrinking beneath the clouds. Naomi's dark eyes, hidden now behind sunglasses, scanned the cabin one last time. Every observer had seen enough to understand that nothing about her was ordinary, and that any future challenge to her authority would have to contend with a woman who had already redefined the rules mid-flight. The plane leveled off at 35,000 feet, the city lights of Chicago flickering below like a constellation of tiny, unaware lives. Naomi Brooks remained in seat 1A, upright, hands folded over her leather bag, eyes scanning every passenger, every subtle twitch of muscle, every micro-expression that revealed intent or prejudice. The cabin had grown still, almost painfully so, as if the engines themselves were holding their breath. From the cockpit, Captain Hargrove's voice crackled softly through the intercom. "Cabin secure? Any issues with passengers?" His tone was clipped, professional, yet there was an undercurrent of unease he hadn't felt before. Naomi leaned back slightly, letting the intercom click off, her mind calculating. She could have revealed her ownership immediately, but the lesson she intended to impart required patience. She observed. She waited. Emily Lawson, the flight attendant, still standing near the galley, shifted uneasily. Her fingers curled around the tablet as if it were a lifeline. She had tried to enforce protocol, to assert authority, but in the presence of Naomi's calm and latent power, it all felt hollow. Every directive she gave now seemed like a whisper in a storm, powerless and almost absurd. A new ripple of tension entered the cabin as Julian Thompson, the VIP, now sobered slightly, tried to reclaim his sense of importance. He slouched in the aisle seat near the front, muttering about family connections, privileges, and anticipated indulgences. Naomi's gaze landed on him briefly. She didn't rise, didn't confront him with words yet, but the glance was enough to make him pause, uncertain, aware for the first time that his assumptions were meaningless. The passengers were quiet, but the subtle energy of their awareness was palpable. Each breath seemed synchronized, each eye flicking from Naomi to Hargrove to Julian. Naomi sensed the calculations running behind those eyes. What does she know? Who is she really? Why hasn't she reacted? Their curiosity was a silent weapon she could wield without saying a word. She reached slowly into her jacket pocket and produced a small, matte black card, embossed with gold lettering and a holographic stripe. The movement was measured, deliberate. Naomi held it for a heartbeat, letting the light catch the edges. The passengers' heads turned almost instinctively. Hargrove's eyes widened imperceptibly. The authority he had clung to was now in question. "Captain," Naomi said, voice low but carrying through the front of the cabin. "I own this airline. I own this plane. You have been overstepping your authority in a manner that endangers staff and passengers alike." Her words were not loud, but they resonated like a strike of judgment. Hargrove's hands flexed at his sides, the rigid posture of command faltering as he processed the shift in power. Julian Thompson's confidence faltered completely. He tried to mask it with a weak smirk, but his unease was visible. He had counted on entitlement and connections, assumed that authority could be purchased or inherited. Naomi's calm defiance made those assumptions meaningless. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't act hastily. Yet the dominance in the room had already shifted. Emily Lawson took a step forward, hesitant. "Ma'am, She stopped, realizing that every word she might speak now could either betray ignorance or confirm complicity. Naomi's gaze met hers, sharp but not cruel. "I understand your role, Emily. But every action in this cabin must be guided by truth, not assumption. The moment you act on bias, everyone suffers. That is your real responsibility." Hargrove swallowed, his face pale under the cabin lights. He had flown thousands of hours, disciplined countless passengers, upheld protocol with rigid certainty. Yet here, in a single moment, every habit, every assumed right, had been invalidated by the presence of someone he had misjudged entirely. Naomi's ownership, her authority, her calm control, had rendered his rank irrelevant. The cabin was silent, but the atmosphere was electric. Naomi didn't have to shout. She didn't have to act aggressively. Her presence alone, combined with the reveal of her ownership, had recalibrated every social hierarchy on board. Julian Thompson slouched further, realizing his status, his arrogance, meant nothing here. The passengers, now fully aware, held their collective attention, witnesses to a lesson in power, patience, and precision. Naomi leaned slightly forward, resting her elbows lightly on the armrests. Her fingers tapped once against the wallet, then remained still. "We will proceed," she said, softly, deliberately. Every word measured, every pause intentional. The engines hummed in harmony with the tension, the hum of the cabin acting as a metronome to the quiet authority she wielded. Captain Hargrove nodded almost imperceptibly, a gesture of reluctant acknowledgement. The hierarchy of the plane had shifted entirely, without violence, without escalation. Naomi had seized control through observation, strategy, and presence. The passengers felt it. The crew felt it. Even the VIP understood, finally, that entitlement had limits. Naomi leaned back, closing her eyes for a brief second, letting the cabin absorb the gravity of her calm authority. In that instant, Every unspoken assumption, every prejudice, every overconfidence had been challenged and undone. The stage was set. The first act of the confrontation concluded, and the air remained taut, ready for the next wave of challenge and resolution. The flight had settled into cruising altitude, the city lights below dissolving into a haze of darkness, tiny constellations of life barely visible through the clouds. Naomi Brooks remained upright in seat 1A, calm and composed, yet her awareness stretched across the cabin like a taut wire. Every subtle movement, every whispered comment, every glance from crew or passenger was logged, assessed, catalogued. The first-class cabin, usually a sanctuary of luxury and ease, now felt like a chessboard, each occupant a piece under silent scrutiny. Captain Thomas Hargrove hovered near the galley, attempting to reassert control. His movements were precise, measured, but they carried a tension that betrayed his uncertainty. He had flown this route hundreds of times, maintained order with authority, yet the presence of Naomi, unassuming and composed, had upended every assumption he had relied on. For decades, his word had been unquestioned. Now, he was the one measured, evaluated, and uncertain. The young flight attendant, Emily Lawson, hovered anxiously near the cabin door, fingers brushing against the tablet she carried. She had believed in the certainty of procedure, the clarity of manifest, the power of her uniform. But now, every action felt meaningless. Her posture stiffened, shoulders tight, as she considered the implications of Naomi's calm defiance. For the first time, protocol felt insufficient. Authority had shifted without a word of force. From the aisle, Julian Thompson, the VIP scheduled to occupy the coveted seat later, leaned against the bulkhead, mid-20s, polished, slightly intoxicated. Confidence radiated from him moments ago, but it faltered under Naomi's quiet power. He attempted a smirk, an assertion of dominance, yet even he sensed the invisible force that now governed the cabin. Every instinct of entitlement and inherited privilege seemed hollow. Naomi's gaze swept the cabin, landing briefly on each person, reading micro-expressions, subtle shifts in posture. A passenger in row 2 adjusted in his seat, as if noticing for the first time that the power dynamics were not what he had assumed. Naomi's calm, deliberate presence conveyed that observation alone was a form of authority, a power more effective than coercion. She reached slowly into her jacket, produced a small black leather wallet, and retrieved a matte black card embossed with gold lettering and a holographic strip. She held it aloft just long enough for Captain Hargrove's eyes to catch it. A flicker of recognition, disbelief, and unease passed over him. Naomi didn't speak. The silence that followed was heavy, a cinematic pause in which authority had been transferred without confrontation. "Captain," Naomi said finally, voice low, controlled, yet carrying through the cabin. "I own this airline. I own this plane. Authority exercised without knowledge is a liability. Compliance does not equal respect, and respect is earned, not assumed." Her words landed like the gavel of a judge, resonating in the enclosed cabin. Hargrove exhaled slowly, trying to reassert control. But he realized that every command he had relied upon for decades was ineffective. His habitual methods of intimidation, projection, and assumed superiority had been invalidated in a single, deliberate stroke. Naomi's patience, timing, and knowledge had dismantled his authority without a single overt act of aggression. Julian Thompson's posture shifted, unease flickering across his features. He had relied on privilege, arrogance, and family connections to claim power. Yet here he sat, immobilized, aware that none of it held sway. The cabin's energy, previously casual and expectant, had condensed into a tense, charged awareness of a single individual's latent authority. Emily stepped forward cautiously, voice low. "Ma'am, I wasn't aware." Her statement hung in the air, incomplete, vulnerable to misinterpretation. Naomi's eyes met hers, sharp but instructive. Emily, authority without understanding is dangerous. Decisions made on assumption are ineffective and potentially harmful. Your role is important, but observation and discretion are equally critical. Hargrove's hands flexed at his sides, the tension in his shoulders increasing. He had spent decades commanding compliance through presence and experience, yet now he found himself outmaneuvered by calm observation and strategic patience. Naomi's revelation had not only altered the immediate situation, but also redefined the hierarchy in the cabin. The passengers felt it. Every subtle shift in posture, every glance, every suppressed murmur was drawn into Naomi's sphere. They were witnesses to a lesson in judgment, restraint, and authority. A silent acknowledgement passed through the cabin. Power does not come from uniform, age, or assumed authority. It comes from knowledge, timing, and composure. Naomi leaned forward slightly, elbows on the armrest, fingers tapping lightly against her wallet. "We will proceed," she said, voice deliberate, controlled, unyielding. The engines hummed, steady and relentless, underscoring the intensity of the moment. Authority had shifted without confrontation, force, or escalation. The captain gave a slight nod, subtle but significant, conceding silently. Even Julian Thompson understood, too late, that entitlement had limits. The passengers, now fully engaged, recognized the reversal. Naomi had transformed what could have been a conflict into a demonstration of control, patience, and insight. Naomi leaned back, closing her eyes briefly, allowing the cabin to absorb the gravity of her presence. In that suspended moment, every assumption, every judgment, every subtle prejudice had been challenged. The first act of confrontation concluded, but the tension remained, taut and expectant. The audience, crew and passengers alike, knew that the unfolding events would continue to test authority, morality, and perception. Every breath in the cabin carried weight. Naomi's calm dominance, strategic patience, and poised authority had shifted the balance. The next moves, though unseen, were already anticipated. She had claimed psychological and moral control, setting the stage for further revelations and the full assertion of her power. The plane hummed steadily, clouds drifting silently beneath. Naomi's eyes opened briefly, dark and measured. Every glance, every gesture, every micro-expression in the cabin was accounted for. Authority had been reclaimed, not through aggression, but through awareness, timing, and an undeniable presence. The story, far from over, had taken a decisive turn. The first-class cabin remained frozen, yet every person aboard felt the weight of the shift in power. Naomi Brooks sat in 1A, upright, her presence commanding without raising her voice. The subtle tilt of her head, the even rhythm of her breathing, and the faint gleam in her eyes told the story of someone who had survived and mastered far more than a simple boarding dispute. She had been underestimated from the moment she walked down the jet bridge, and now the scale of that misjudgment hung palpably in the air. Captain Thomas Hargrove leaned slightly against the galley counter, hands flexing at his sides. He had spent decades commanding compliance through authority, through fear, through subtle intimidation. Yet here, his years of experience counted for nothing. He could issue orders, attempt to assert dominance, but Naomi had already reshaped the hierarchy. The uniform that once gave him unquestioned presence now felt thin, fragile, almost theatrical. Emily Lawson, the flight attendant who had first challenged Naomi, pressed her lips together, fingers brushing over the tablet she carried. The cabin's eyes followed every slight gesture. She had assumed she understood the chain of command, that her assessment of passengers was absolute. Naomi's calm intelligence had dismantled that belief in seconds. Every instruction she had given now felt both trivial and potentially dangerous if enforced blindly. In the aisle, Julian Thompson slouched, unsteady, a mixture of disbelief and fear passing over his features. He had expected entitlement and privilege to shield him, to validate his behavior. Naomi's mere presence, her quiet control, rendered that assumption meaningless. He could no longer assert dominance through swagger, wealth, or the name of his father. The arrogance he relied on was suddenly irrelevant. Naomi's fingers tapped lightly on the matte black wallet she had pulled from her jacket. Inside were credentials that verified her ownership of the airline. She held it poised, deliberate. The gold-embossed letters glinted under the cabin lights, catching the eyes of every passenger within range. Hargrove's expression tightened, an involuntary swallow, the realization of misjudgment dawning slowly. Authority had been challenged, and the truth of ownership had upended the expected order. Her voice, calm and deliberate, cut across the stillness. "Captain, you may command the operation of this aircraft, but you do not dictate justice in the cabin. Orders enforced without awareness endanger staff, passengers, and ultimately yourself. Authority must be exercised with understanding, not assumption." The words landed like a controlled strike. Each syllable carried weight, not raised in anger, but absolute in clarity. Emily moved subtly, unsure whether to step closer or retreat. Naomi's eyes met hers for a heartbeat, conveying instruction without gesture. Observe. Measure. Act only with insight. Anything less is failure, she said, and the statement sank deep into the flight attendant's consciousness. Authority was no longer about command. It was about judgment. Julian shifted again, unease etching itself into his posture. His intoxicated confidence had crumbled under the force of Naomi's calm power. He was immobilized, trapped in the realization that inherited or purchased status could not compete with observation, patience, and calculated control. Every instinct of entitlement he carried seemed suddenly inadequate. Passengers in the first-class cabin were still, some holding phones, some simply watching. Every glance, every whisper, every subtle movement was accounted for in Naomi's awareness. She did not need to shout, to gesticulate, to display overt dominance. The psychological space of authority had already shifted. The room understood that power was no longer in the uniform or the title. Naomi leaned forward slightly, letting her presence fill the cabin without motion. "We will proceed," she said, softly, deliberately. Each word measured, weighted, and the engines hummed in alignment with the rhythm of tension she had orchestrated. Compliance had been won without threat, confrontation, or force. The stage was set, authority fully reclaimed, and the cabin collectively acknowledged the new hierarchy. Hargrove gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, yet the concession was unmistakable. Julian Thompson slumped further, fully aware of the lesson. The passengers, witnessing the transformation, understood the potency of composure, timing, and insight. Naomi had shifted the power dynamics entirely, teaching, observing, and commanding simultaneously. The plane hummed steadily along its flight path, the city below lost in darkness. Naomi's eyes opened briefly, scanning the cabin with precision, calculating, observing. Every micro-expression, every subtle gesture, every hint of dissent had been noted. Authority had been restored not through aggression, but through mastery of presence, awareness, and strategy. The next moves, though unseen, would follow the rules Naomi had set, and the cabin was fully aligned with her silent command. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a low, steady pulse beneath the taut tension that Naomi Brooks had orchestrated. She remained in seat 1A, upright, composed, eyes scanning the rows of first-class passengers, noting subtle shifts in posture, the way hands gripped armrests, the flicker of curiosity or doubt in the eyes around her. Every breath, every micro-movement in the cabin carried meaning, and Naomi absorbed it all with deliberate calm. Captain Thomas Hargrove stood near the cockpit entrance, posture rigid, hands pressed lightly against the bulkhead. He had flown thousands of hours, handled countless unruly passengers, enforced rules with an authority that rarely faced challenge. Yet now, the quiet presence of Naomi, a woman he had misjudged completely, had unsettled him in ways he had never anticipated. The authority he assumed was absolute felt suddenly conditional. Emily Lawson hovered near the galley, fingers brushing against the edge of her tablet. Each second she spent under Naomi's watchful eyes reminded her that authority without understanding was fragile. She had attempted to enforce protocol, to assert control over what she believed was a simple boarding dispute. But every action she considered now seemed ill-placed, almost naive. The woman in seat 1A had not raised her voice, yet she had shifted the cabin's hierarchy entirely. Julian Thompson, the VIP son of a senator, slouched uneasily in his aisle seat. Confidence and entitlement had shielded him for most of his life, but under Naomi's quiet control, he found himself exposed, vulnerable, powerless. His usual tactics, swagger, charm, references to wealth and influence, were rendered meaningless by a single, deliberate presence. The realization settled over him like ice. Entitlement alone could not command compliance. Naomi's fingers tapped lightly against her wallet. Inside, the black matte card with gold embossing and a holographic strip verified her ownership of Liberty Airways. She let it rest just long enough for Captain Hargrove's gaze to catch it. The shift in his expression, from authority to disbelief, was subtle but unmistakable. Her calm had accomplished what no argument, no threat, no escalation could have achieved. Complete, unquestioned command of the situation. "Captain," Naomi said, voice low and controlled, carrying easily across the cabin. "Your role is to operate the aircraft. My role, as owner, includes the welfare of staff and passengers alike. Authority exercised without awareness is a risk, not a safeguard. Compliance is not respect, and respect cannot be coerced." Each word landed deliberately, a surgical strike aimed at unraveling assumptions. Emily stepped forward hesitantly, unsure if she should speak or retreat. Naomi's gaze met hers, firm but instructive. Observation, measurement, and informed action are your tools. Anything less invites failure. "Authority is meaningless without understanding," she said, and the lesson embedded itself in the young flight attendant's consciousness. Julian Thompson shifted in his seat, unease spreading through his posture. The arrogance he had carried like armor was meaningless here. He was immobilized, forced to recognize that privilege and family connections could not protect him from authority rooted in awareness and composure. Every instinct of entitlement he had depended upon now felt hollow. The cabin's energy was tense, almost cinematic, with passengers silently acknowledging the transformation. Phones discreetly raised to record, whispers rippling quietly through the rows. But Naomi remained entirely unmoved, entirely in control. Authority had been claimed through presence, patience, and insight, without aggression or confrontation. Naomi leaned slightly forward, resting her elbows lightly on the armrests. "We will proceed," she said softly, deliberately, her tone carrying a weight that reverberated through the cabin. Engines hummed, synchronized with the taut rhythm of the cabin's new equilibrium. Compliance had been secured, the lesson delivered. Authority had been quietly reclaimed. Captain Hargrove gave a small, imperceptible nod. It was a concession, almost involuntary. Julian Thompson slouched further, fully aware that the rules of the cabin and his assumptions of privilege had been irrevocably altered. The passengers, witnesses to this quiet mastery, recognized the potency of observation, timing, and composed authority. Naomi had executed the first act of control, setting a standard for the rest of the flight. The plane glided through the darkened sky, city lights far below, and Naomi's eyes opened briefly, scanning the cabin with precision. Every passenger, every subtle movement, every micro-expression was noted, understood, and accounted for. Authority had been restored not through force, but through strategy, patience, and unyielding presence. The stage was set for the next series of moves, each contingent on the lesson Naomi had just imparted, and the cabin, from crew to passengers, was aligned under her silent command. The night outside was deep and quiet, the lights of the city below twinkling like distant stars, barely visible through the haze of clouds. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension, an almost tangible energy that pressed against the walls, the seats, the very skin of the passengers. Naomi Brooks sat in seat 1A, her posture impeccable, her eyes scanning with unyielding focus. Every movement in the cabin, from the shuffle of a blanket to the tap of a foot, was catalogued in her mind, each detail a thread in the larger pattern of control she was weaving. Captain Thomas Hargrove stood near the galley, hands loosely resting on the counter, jaw tight, eyes flicking toward Naomi every few seconds. He had flown this route countless times, exercised authority over hundreds of flights, but in this moment, every practiced command felt meaningless. The uniform he wore, once a symbol of unquestioned control, now seemed fragile under the weight of what he had just witnessed. Authority was no longer dictated by rank. It had been quietly seized by presence, observation, and precision. Emily Lawson, the young flight attendant who had initially confronted Naomi, hovered nervously near the cabin door. The tablet in her hands felt suddenly heavy, irrelevant. She had believed herself to be the enforcer of order, a conduit of protocol. But Naomi's calm, deliberate composure rendered all prior assumptions hollow. Every instruction Emily had given now seemed trivial, almost foolish. She realized that true authority relied not on the uniform, the title, or adherence to arbitrary rules, but on the intelligent application of judgment and patience. Julian Thompson, the VIP son of a prominent senator, shifted uneasily in his seat, suddenly aware that his usual tactics of entitlement, charm, and inherited power were ineffective. Naomi's quiet dominance rendered them meaningless. For the first time, he recognized that status without substance was powerless. He slouched, hesitant, unsure how to assert himself. The arrogance and confidence that had carried him through so many social arenas now faltered in the presence of someone who understood the balance of observation and control. Naomi's hand rested lightly on her black, matte wallet, the gold-embossed ID and holographic strip catching the cabin lights. The subtle flash was enough to make Hargrove's eyes widen ever so slightly. He was a man trained to command, to assume control. Yet the revelation of Naomi's ownership had upended the established hierarchy. The shift was instantaneous and undeniable. Every passenger, every member of the crew, understood that something fundamental had changed. Her voice, low and deliberate, cut through the cabin. "Captain, you may operate this aircraft, but authority without awareness endangers staff, passengers, and operations alike. Compliance is not respect, and respect cannot be coerced." The words landed like measured blows, precise and undeniable. Hargrove's hands flexed at his sides, a subtle tremor betraying the strain of recognizing a new order. Emily stepped forward, cautious, her voice tentative. "Ma'am, she faltered, unsure if speaking might expose ignorance or confirm complicity. Naomi's eyes met hers, instructive but calm. "Observe, measure, and act only with insight. Anything less is failure. Authority is meaningless without understanding." The lesson was clear, and Emily felt its weight immediately. Julian's unease deepened. He had relied on privilege and inherited influence, but under Naomi's control, it counted for nothing. He realized that the arrogance he had used as armor was now an obstacle. Every instinct of entitlement faltered, leaving him exposed and powerless in the face of calculated observation and composed authority. The cabin itself felt cinematic, almost surreal. Every whispered exchange, every subtle glance, every half-hidden recording on a phone contributed to the collective understanding of the shift that had occurred. Naomi had altered the dynamics of the space without raising her voice, without confronting anyone directly, and yet her control was complete. Leaning forward slightly, elbows resting lightly on the armrests, Naomi spoke softly but deliberately. "We will proceed." The cadence of her words, the precise timing, underscored the authority she now wielded. The engines hummed in tandem with the tension, a soundtrack to the recalibration she had orchestrated. Compliance had been established. The cabin recognized a new order. Hargrove gave a subtle nod, almost imperceptible, yet it was acknowledgement. Julian slumped further, the lesson in humility complete. Passengers, witnessing the recalibration, understood that observation, patience, and presence were more powerful than any outward display of status or rank. Naomi's first act of authority had been executed flawlessly, leaving the cabin aligned with her control, ready for the unfolding events to follow. The plane glided silently above the city, clouds stretching endlessly below. Naomi's eyes opened briefly, scanning the cabin, noting every micro-expression, every gesture, every shift in posture. Authority had been reclaimed, not through confrontation or force, but through intelligence, timing, and unwavering presence. The stage for the next sequence of events was set, every occupant aware that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The cabin remained tense, the subtle hum of the engines underscoring the charged silence. Naomi Brooks shifted slightly in her seat, just enough to adjust her posture, and every movement seemed deliberate, precise. Her dark eyes scanned the rows, noting reactions, gestures, the faintest twitch of a hand or a shift in a shoulder. She wasn't merely observing, she was cataloguing, understanding the emotional landscape of every passenger and crew member. The entire first-class cabin felt like it had been suspended in a moment of profound clarity, and everyone sensed it. Captain Thomas Hargrove moved back toward the cockpit, his shoulders stiff, jaw tight. He had assumed the weight of authority would carry him through any challenge. Decades of command, thousands of hours in the air, had instilled in him a confidence bordering on arrogance. But Naomi's quiet presence, combined with the revealed truth of her ownership, had upended every assumption. His authority, once unassailable, was suddenly provisional. He was forced to measure every word, every movement, against the woman seated in 1A. Emily Lawson lingered near the galley, tablet pressed to her chest, knuckles white. She had been certain of the rules, certain of the chain of command, but Naomi's presence had turned every certainty on its head. The young flight attendant's eyes flicked nervously to each passenger, noting how even the hedge fund manager in seat 1B now sat straighter, aware that Naomi's influence reached beyond her words. Julian Thompson, slouched in the aisle seat near the front, attempted to regain composure, but each breath betrayed him. His entitlement, the confidence he had relied upon, had been neutralized. He realized that wealth, youth, and social connections could not command respect in the face of deliberate intelligence, timing, and observation. Naomi's calm dominance exposed him in a way no rebuke or physical action could. Naomi's fingers brushed the edge of her wallet, the matte black card inside glinting faintly under the cabin lights. Hargrove's gaze fell on it again, the realization settling that this woman was not a mere passenger, but the very owner of the aircraft, and the airline itself. Authority, as he had understood it, was now secondary to presence and knowledge. The subtle shift in the room was palpable. Passengers and crew alike recognized the new hierarchy. Her voice, low and measured, broke the silence. "Captain, the responsibility of command includes safety and order, yes, But authority exercised without awareness endangers everyone on board. Compliance is not respect, and respect cannot be coerced. Each word resonated like a gavel striking a courtroom bench. Hargrove's hands flexed involuntarily at his sides, the long years of confidence faltering under the weight of a simple, undeniable truth. Emily stepped forward, voice quiet, uncertain. "Mom, She paused, struggling to articulate what she had just witnessed, realizing that anything she might say could either confirm ignorance or display complicity. Naomi's eyes met hers, sharp but instructive. Observation, careful measurement, and informed action define authority. Anything less is failure. The young flight attendant nodded imperceptibly, absorbing the lesson. Julian's shoulders slumped further, his earlier arrogance stripped away by the sheer weight of Naomi's calm. Privilege and wealth, tools he had relied upon for years, were powerless here. He realized the difference between assumed authority and earned command, a difference Naomi had demonstrated silently, efficiently, and completely. The cabin's energy shifted into something almost cinematic. Phones were raised discreetly. Whispers ran through the rows. And yet Naomi remained seated, in complete control, unaffected by the observation. She had reshaped the social dynamics without a word of aggression, without confrontation, without raising her voice. Presence alone had established dominance. Naomi leaned forward slightly, elbows resting lightly on the armrests. "We will proceed," she said deliberately, softly enough to be calm, yet carrying a resonance that filled the cabin. The engine's low hum became a rhythmic underscore to the psychological shift she had orchestrated. Compliance had been established, hierarchy reset, and everyone present understood it. Captain Hargrove's small nod, almost imperceptible, marked an acknowledgement of the new order. Julian Thompson sank into his seat, humbled and aware that his assumptions of privilege were meaningless in the face of observation, patience, and strategy. Passengers, witnessing the subtle mastery, understood that authority could be asserted without force, that power could be measured and enforced with precision. Naomi's first act of control was complete, and the cabin was aligned under her silent command, ready for whatever would unfold next. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane settled into a quiet rhythm, the steady hum of the engines a backdrop to the charged tension that lingered in the air. Naomi Brooks remained in seat 1A, her posture unyielding, her gaze sweeping methodically across the rows of passengers and crew. Each flicker of movement, each subtle intake of breath, each twitch of a hand was noted, logged, and assessed. The first-class cabin, a space usually defined by luxury and entitlement, now felt like a theater, every participant a performer under her silent direction. Captain Thomas Hargrove stood near the cockpit doorway, arms crossed, jaw tight. He had spent decades commanding authority, managing turbulence, and asserting control over passengers, crew, and situations alike. Yet, in Naomi's calm, poised presence, his decades of experience seemed insufficient. The uniform, the rank, the assumed power, all now felt secondary to the unspoken command she exuded. Authority had shifted, without violence, without confrontation, purely through observation, timing, and measured presence. Emily Lawson, the flight attendant who had initially approached Naomi, shifted uneasily. The tablet she held felt suddenly insignificant, a symbol of her earlier assumptions about order and control. She had believed her role was absolute. The procedure and protocol alone could maintain command. Naomi's quiet, deliberate presence had rendered those assumptions obsolete. Emily's eyes flicked to the other passengers. Even the hedge fund manager in seat 1B now sat straighter, aware that the dynamic in the cabin had changed irrevocably. Julian Thompson, the VIP heir, slouched further in his aisle seat, unease etched into every movement. Confidence, charm, inherited influence, tools that had shielded him throughout life, were ineffective against Naomi's quiet mastery. He realized, belatedly, that entitlement carried no weight when authority was rooted in intelligence, observation, and self-possession. Naomi's calm dominance had rendered him powerless, and for the first time, he understood the limits of privilege. Naomi's fingers lightly brushed the edge of her wallet, revealing the matte black card embossed with gold letters and a holographic strip. The subtle flash caught Captain Hargrove's eyes again, confirming the revelation that Naomi was the owner of the airline. The authority he had relied upon, rank, tenure, uniform, was irrelevant. The cabin seemed to absorb the shift, every passenger and crew member recognizing the silent reordering of power. Her voice, measured, low, but resonant, broke the silence. "Captain, your authority over this aircraft is unquestioned. But authority exercised without awareness endangers staff, passengers, and the operation itself. Compliance does not equal respect, and respect cannot be coerced." Each word struck precisely, deliberate and exact, reverberating through the cabin, as if the very walls acknowledged the correction of imbalance. Hargrove's hands flexed slightly, involuntarily, as the truth settled in. His experience and confidence were not enough here. Emily took a tentative step forward, unsure how to respond. "Ma'am, I—" Her voice faltered. She could not finish, aware that anything she might say could either display ignorance or confirm complicity. Naomi's eyes met hers, calm, sharp, instructive. Observation, careful measurement, and informed action define authority. Anything less is failure. The young flight attendant nodded, the lesson sinking in with the weight of clarity. Julian Thompson's unease deepened, the arrogance he had carried like armor dissolving. Wealth and social position were irrelevant. He was exposed, stripped of any ability to influence the cabin. Naomi's control, enacted without force, had rendered privilege meaningless. The passengers sensed it, the crew felt it, and Julian could only retreat into the awareness of his own impotence. The cabin's atmosphere grew cinematic, a mixture of charged silence and invisible electricity. Phones discreetly raised to record, murmurs rippling through the rows, but Naomi remained seated, controlled, and in full command. Authority had shifted. The room was realigned, hierarchy redefined, yet without a single raised voice or overt action. Naomi leaned forward slightly, elbows resting lightly on her armrests. "We will proceed," she said, softly, deliberate, resonant. The engine's low hum synchronized with the cadence of her words, reinforcing the sense of control she had established. Compliance had been secured, the cabin aligned, and her authority recognized without question. Captain Hargrove gave a subtle nod, almost imperceptible, an acknowledgement of the new reality. Julian slouched further, humbled, aware that assumptions of privilege were insufficient against intelligence, presence, and timing. The passengers, witnessing the execution of control, understood that power could be asserted without aggression, and that true authority rested in observation, patience, and calculated action. Naomi's first act of dominance was complete. The cabin had been realigned under her silent, absolute command. The cabin was thick with tension as Naomi Brooks stood in the aisle, her presence slicing through the residual hum of the engines. Julian Thompson, the senator's son, was still strapped into seat 1A, wide-eyed and trembling, finally aware that his usual arrogance had no currency here. He blinked, trying to recalibrate his expectations, but every glance at Naomi reinforced his helplessness. She didn't raise her voice, didn't make a single aggressive movement, yet the authority she commanded was absolute, undeniable. Captain Thomas Hargrove stood frozen near the cockpit door, uniform crisp but meaningless, the years of assumed power crumbling in the space of a heartbeat. Naomi's black matte card glinted in her hand, the gold lettering catching the cabin lights. It was not a threat. It was evidence. It was judgment. Julian attempted to speak, his voice shaky. I'm not. Naomi's eyes locked on him, dark, controlled, and unmoving. Sit, she said. The word was calm, quiet, but in it lay the force of law, strategy, and unshakable resolve. Julian slumped into his seat, the realization settling fully that wealth, name, and entitlement could not counter the weight of truth and authority. Naomi let the moment breathe, her gaze sweeping the cabin, taking in every reaction. The young flight attendants gripping their trays, the passengers frozen mid-breath, the captain paralyzed by the collapse of his perceived control. Emily Lawson stepped forward cautiously, voice low. "Ma'am, should I?" Naomi's glance stopped her, a subtle nod signaling understanding but demanding precision. Observe, protect, ensure safety. Authority without knowledge is danger. Anything else is irrelevant, Naomi said, calm but unflinching. Emily exhaled, understanding the lesson, her hands loosening around the tablet. She had assumed enforcement of policy was her measure of power, but now she understood the depth of presence and timing as tools stronger than uniform or title. Naomi walked slowly to the galley, passing the first-class passengers with a calm deliberation that seemed to bend the air around her. Each step measured, purposeful, a quiet assertion of dominance. The cabin, previously buzzing with whispers and secret recordings, fell into a collective awareness. Every observer understood the stakes and the player. She could have shouted, called security, made an immediate escalation. But she waited. Observation was power, timing was control, and the lesson would land with maximum clarity. Julian tried to shift his weight, muttering about his father and connections, but Naomi's calm assessment froze him in place. The arrogance that had carried him through decades of entitlement was ineffective against someone who had mastered observation, patience, and influence. He swallowed hard, aware that any further misstep could result in public and professional consequences far beyond the cabin. Naomi did not flinch, did not waver, did not speak beyond the precision required to assert control. Captain Hargrove attempted a measured intervention, stepping forward. "Ms. Brooks, your actions," Naomi interrupted, voice crisp, controlled, and perfectly audible throughout the cabin. "Captain, your role is to operate the aircraft. My role encompasses the welfare of staff, passengers, and operations. Authority exercised without awareness is a risk. Compliance does not equal respect, and respect cannot be coerced." The statement landed like a physical blow, deliberate, calculated, leaving no room for debate. Hargrove's jaw tightened, hands flexing at his sides, as decades of assumed authority met a force they could not contend with. Naomi's hand brushed the wallet in her jacket, allowing the gold-embossed identification to catch the light once more. Every passenger saw it. Every crew member registered the shift. Authority had been redefined, without a single display of aggression. The cabin had recalibrated instantly, hierarchy realigned, and every micro-expression broadcasted the truth. Naomi Brooks was not a passenger. She was the airline, the ultimate authority in that space. The young flight attendants adjusted, understanding finally that blind adherence to protocol was insufficient. Every instruction, every decision would now be informed by the awareness that their authority had limits, and that the judgment of the true owner was paramount. Emily's fingers flexed on the tablet, aware that compliance alone was no longer enough. Presence, calculation, and timing were now the ultimate measures of authority. Julian's unease deepened as Naomi's quiet dominance radiated outward. Wealth, youth, influence, entitlement, all the tools he had relied upon were ineffective. He realized belatedly that his assumptions about power had been naive. Naomi had shifted the dynamics of the cabin without a single overtly hostile act, without escalation, without verbal assault. Observation and strategy had been enough to assert total control. Naomi turned to the captain briefly, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "Ensure the remainder of the flight is conducted according to safety and protocol. Any further disruption will be noted and addressed by management." Authority without awareness is worthless. Compliance without understanding is dangerous. Her voice carried, precise and measured, yet the resonance of its weight filled every corner of the cabin. The plane hummed steadily, engines vibrating subtly beneath the fuselage as the cityscape below blurred into darkness. Naomi leaned back slightly, letting the cabin absorb the gravity of her control. Every passenger, crew member, and the humbled VIP recognized the recalibration of power. Authority had been claimed not by aggression, not by intimidation, but through timing, presence, and undeniable truth. Every movement, every glance, every micro-expression had been accounted for and aligned under her command. As the flight progressed, Naomi moved with measured purpose, checking on the crew, observing the passengers, ensuring order without force. Julian sat subdued, aware that his behavior had been judged and corrected without the need for intervention beyond presence. Captain Hargrove remained near the cockpit, silent, digesting the lesson, his assumed omnipotence reduced to procedural compliance. The first-class cabin, once a space of perceived privilege and unquestioned authority, had been transformed into a theater of accountability and respect. Naomi's quiet command had recalibrated every relationship, every hierarchy, and every expectation within the enclosed space. Observation, patience, and precision had been sufficient to assert absolute authority. By the time the plane began its descent into Chicago, the cabin had shifted entirely. Crew members moved with awareness, passengers with quiet acknowledgement of Naomi's presence, and the VIP learned a lesson in humility that would linger far beyond the flight. Naomi Brooks returned to her seat, calm, composed, satisfied that the balance of authority had been corrected and the lesson unmistakably delivered. Passengers adjusted, some whispering, some recording, all witnesses to a demonstration of power, judgment, and control, executed flawlessly and without aggression. Naomi's presence alone had recalibrated every expectation, reasserted authority, and commanded respect. As the aircraft touched down, engines roaring in reverse, Naomi leaned back in her seat, dark eyes scanning the cabin one final time. The lesson had been delivered. Order, respect, and awareness had been re-established. Authority had been claimed through intelligence, timing, and presence. The passengers, the crew, and the humbled VIP understood that nothing in the cabin, or beyond, was as it seemed. If you enjoyed this story of power, justice, and control, like, subscribe, and comment now. Ask 3.